Francis Bacon begins his philosophy with a sharp break from the past, not by rejecting knowledge itself, but by questioning the way knowledge has been pursued for centuries. He looks at the traditions of philosophy and learning that came before him and sees a pattern of repetition, argument, and reliance on authority that has produced far more words than results. The problem, as he sees it, is not that human beings lack intelligence, but that they have been using their intelligence in the wrong way. Instead of building knowledge from careful observation of the world, thinkers have often begun with assumptions and tried to fit reality into them. They have trusted inherited systems, ancient texts, and abstract reasoning without first grounding their thought in experience. For Bacon, this approach leads to confusion. It creates systems that appear logical but do not truly connect with how the world works. From this starting point, he introduces a new direction, one that begins not with theory, but with observation. Knowledge must be built from the ground up, starting with what can be seen, tested, and examined. Instead of rushing toward conclusions, the mind must move slowly, gathering evidence, comparing instances, and allowing patterns to emerge over time. This method is not simply a technical adjustment. It represents a fundamental shift in how the human mind approaches truth. The goal is not to defend ideas, but to discover them. Knowledge becomes something that grows through interaction with the world, rather than something imposed upon it. At the same time, Bacon recognizes that the mind itself is not a neutral instrument. It is influenced by habits, assumptions, and tendencies that distort perception. Before knowledge can be built properly, these distortions must be understood. He identifies different kinds of errors that affect human thinking, patterns that lead the mind away from clear understanding. Some of these errors arise from human nature itself. The mind tends to see patterns even where none exist, to prefer simplicity over complexity, and to hold on to beliefs once they are formed. These tendencies are not intentional, but they shape how reality is perceived. Other errors come from individual experience. Each person develops habits of thought based on their background, their education, and their environment. These personal influences create differences in how the same thing is understood, leading to disagreement and confusion. There are also errors that come from language. Words are often imprecise, shaped by common use rather than careful definition. They can create the illusion of understanding even when the underlying ideas are unclear. When people rely too heavily on language without examining its meaning, they can become trapped in arguments that do not lead to real knowledge. Finally, there are errors that come from established systems of thought. Philosophical traditions, once accepted, can become rigid. They are repeated and defended rather than questioned. This creates a situation where ideas are preserved not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Bacon sees these patterns not as isolated mistakes, but as obstacles that must be actively addressed. If the mind is left to its natural tendencies, it will continue to produce the same kinds of errors. A new method is needed, one that guides thinking in a more disciplined way. This is where his idea of a systematic approach to inquiry becomes central. Instead of relying on sudden insight or abstract reasoning alone, knowledge must be developed through a structured process. Observations are collected, organized, and compared. From these comparisons, tentative conclusions are drawn, but they are always open to revision. This process requires patience. It resists the desire for immediate answers. The mind must be willing to remain uncertain, to gather more evidence, and to refine its understanding gradually. This slow movement is not a weakness, but a strength. It reduces the risk of error and allows knowledge to be built on a more solid foundation. At the same time, Bacon's philosophy is not purely theoretical. He connects knowledge directly to human life. The purpose of understanding the world is not only to explain it, but to interact with it more effectively. Knowledge should lead to practical results, improving the conditions of life and expanding what human beings are capable of doing. This idea transforms the role of science. It is no longer just a way of thinking, but a way of engaging with reality. Through careful study and experimentation, new possibilities emerge. Nature is not something to be passively observed, but something that can be understood and worked with. However, this does not mean domination in a careless sense. Bacon emphasizes that nature reveals its patterns only when approached with discipline and respect for its complexity. Attempts to force conclusions without proper method lead back to error. True progress requires alignment with the way the world actually operates. This alignment is achieved through the gradual refinement of method. Each observation contributes to a larger structure of understanding. Over time, patterns become clearer, relationships more defined, and knowledge more reliable. The process is continuous, always open to further development. As this way of thinking takes shape, it begins to replace older habits of thought. Authority becomes less important than evidence. Tradition becomes something to be examined rather than accepted. The focus shifts from defending established ideas to discovering new ones. This shift also changes how disagreement is handled. Instead of arguing from fixed positions, inquiry becomes collaborative. Different observations and perspectives contribute to a shared process of understanding. The goal is not to win arguments, but to refine knowledge. At the same time, Bacon is aware that this transformation will not happen easily. The habits of thought he criticizes are deeply rooted. Changing them requires more than new ideas. It requires a change in practice, in education, and in the way knowledge is pursued collectively. This is why his philosophy extends beyond individual thinking into the organization of learning itself. Institutions, methods, and systems must be structured in a way that supports careful inquiry rather than repetition. Knowledge becomes a shared effort, built over time rather than produced in isolation. In this way, Francis Bacon sets the foundation for a new approach to understanding the world, one that begins with observation, recognizes the limitations of the human mind, and develops a disciplined method for overcoming those limitations, creating a path toward knowledge that is both reliable and capable of transforming how human beings live and interact with reality. As this new way of approaching knowledge begins to take shape, the philosophy moves deeper into the actual mechanics of how understanding is built, because for Francis Bacon, it is not enough to say that observation matters. The critical question is how observation is used, how raw experience is transformed into reliable knowledge without falling back into the same errors that have misled thinkers for generations. He becomes especially focused on the process of moving from particular instances to general principles. The human mind naturally wants to jump quickly from a few observations to broad conclusions, but this tendency is precisely what leads to distortion. Instead of rushing upward, Bacon insists that the mind must proceed step by step, constructing knowledge through careful comparison and gradual refinement. This method is often described as a kind of disciplined induction, but in his view, it is far more structured than simple generalization. Observations must be collected systematically, not randomly. Instances must be arranged in ways that reveal differences as well as similarities. The absence of a phenomenon can be just as important as its presence, because it helps define the conditions under which something occurs. By organizing observations in this way, patterns begin to emerge that are not immediately visible. These patterns are not imposed by the mind, but discovered through interaction with the material itself. The role of the thinker is not to invent explanations, but to uncover relationships that are already there, hidden within the complexity of experience. At the same time, Bacon is careful to avoid the illusion that a single pattern explains everything. Each conclusion remains provisional, open to correction as new evidence appears. This openness is essential because it prevents knowledge from hardening into rigid systems that resist change. This introduces a new kind of humility into the pursuit of knowledge. Certainty is no longer claimed too quickly. Instead, understanding is treated as something that develops over time, becoming more reliable as it is tested and refined. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty completely, but to reduce it through careful method. Experimentation plays a crucial role in this process. Observation alone is not always enough. because many aspects of nature do not reveal themselves under ordinary conditions. By creating controlled situations, one can isolate specific factors and examine how they behave. This allows for a more precise understanding of cause and effect. However, experimentation is not random manipulation. It must be guided by the same disciplined approach that governs observation. Each experiment is part of a larger structure of inquiry, designed to clarify relationships rather than produce isolated results. Without this structure, experiments can generate data without meaning. Through this combination of observation and experiment, knowledge begins to take on a cumulative character. Each step builds upon previous ones, creating a growing body of understanding that becomes more stable over time. This stability does not come from fixed conclusions, but from the strength of the process that produces them. At the same time, Bacon continues to emphasize the obstacles that can interfere with this process. The tendencies of the mind do not disappear simply because a method has been proposed. They must be actively resisted. Even within a structured approach, there is always the risk of seeing what one expects to see or favoring results that confirm existing beliefs. This is why discipline is so central to his philosophy. The method is not only a tool for discovering knowledge, it is also a way of controlling the impulses of the mind. By following a structured process, the thinker reduces the influence of bias and increases the reliability of the results. This disciplined approach also changes how knowledge is evaluated. Instead of relying on authority or tradition, ideas are judged based on how well they correspond to observed patterns and how effectively they can be tested. This creates a more objective standard, where claims must be supported by evidence rather than accepted by reputation. At the same time, Bacon does not view knowledge as an isolated activity. He sees it as something that should be shared, organized, and developed collectively. Individual insight is valuable, but it becomes far more powerful when integrated into a broader effort. Knowledge grows through collaboration, where different observations and perspectives contribute to a common goal. This leads to a vision of organized inquiry, where the pursuit of knowledge is supported by institutions designed to collect, preserve, and expand understanding. These institutions are not meant to enforce doctrine, but to facilitate discovery. They provide the structure within which the method can be applied consistently over time. Within this framework, the purpose of knowledge becomes increasingly clear. It is not only about understanding the world in an abstract sense, but about expanding human capability. By uncovering the patterns that govern natural processes, it becomes possible to interact with them more effectively, to create new tools, improve conditions, and extend what human beings can achieve. This practical dimension does not diminish the value of knowledge. It reinforces it. Understanding becomes meaningful not only because it explains, but because it enables action. The more accurate the understanding, the more effective the action. At the same time, Bacon remains aware that this power carries responsibility. Acting without proper understanding can lead to unintended consequences. This is why the method must remain careful and disciplined. Power should grow alongside knowledge, not ahead of it. As this philosophy develops further, it begins to reshape the entire approach to learning. Education is no longer centered on memorizing established ideas, but on training the mind to observe, analyze, and think systematically. Students are not only taught what is known, but how knowledge is formed. This shift creates a different kind of thinker, one who is less dependent on authority and more capable of independent inquiry. Such a thinker does not accept ideas simply because they are widely held, but examines them in light of evidence and method. In this way, the philosophy moves from a critique of past approaches to a detailed framework for building knowledge in a new way. One that emphasizes gradual progress, disciplined thinking, collaborative effort, and the continuous refinement of understanding, creating a foundation for a form of inquiry that is both more reliable and more closely connected to the structure of the world itself. As this method becomes more firmly established, the philosophy begins to expand beyond the process of discovery itself and into a broader vision of how knowledge transforms the entire structure of human life. Because for Francis Bacon, the reform of thinking is not an isolated intellectual project. It is the beginning of a much larger change, one that reshapes how societies function, how progress is understood, and how human potential is realized over time. At this stage, knowledge is no longer seen as something static that accumulates slowly without direction. It becomes a force that can actively reshape the world. When inquiry is guided by disciplined observation and careful experimentation, it produces results that extend far beyond theory. It creates new tools, new techniques, and new possibilities that alter the conditions of life itself. This introduces a new idea of progress, one that is grounded not in abstract ideals, but in the gradual expansion of human capability. Progress is not measured by the preservation of tradition or the repetition of established knowledge, but by the ability to discover, refine, and apply new understanding. Each generation has the potential to go further than the previous one, not because it is inherently superior, but because it builds upon a growing foundation of knowledge. This cumulative nature of knowledge is central to Bacon's vision. Unlike systems that rely heavily on authority, where ideas are often repeated without significant development, his approach encourages continuous advancement. What is discovered is not final. It becomes the starting point for further inquiry. Knowledge grows outward, expanding in both depth and scope. At the same time, this expansion requires careful organization. Without structure, the accumulation of information can become overwhelming and disordered. Bacon envisions a coordinated effort where knowledge is classified, recorded, and made accessible, allowing future inquiry to build efficiently on what has already been achieved. This organization transforms knowledge into a shared resource rather than a collection of isolated insights. It reduces duplication of effort and allows different areas of study to inform one another. Patterns discovered in one domain may reveal connections in another, creating a network of understanding that becomes increasingly integrated. Within this expanding structure, the relationship between theory and practice becomes more closely aligned. Ideas are not developed in isolation from application. They are tested, refined, and often reshaped through their interaction with the world. This creates a feedback loop where theory informs practice, and practice in turn deepens theory. This interaction also changes how failure is understood. In earlier approaches, an incorrect conclusion might be seen as a setback or a flaw in reasoning. In Bacon's framework, failure becomes part of the process. An experiment that does not produce the expected result still contributes to understanding by revealing what does not work or by clarifying the conditions under which certain outcomes occur. This redefinition of failure encourages persistence and openness. It allows inquiry to continue without the fear of being wrong, because being wrong is recognized as a step toward being less wrong. Knowledge advances not by avoiding error entirely, but by identifying and correcting it over time. At the same time, Bacon remains aware that the growth of knowledge brings with it an increase in power. As human beings become more capable of influencing natural processes, the consequences of their actions become more significant. This introduces a deeper level of responsibility that cannot be ignored. The method he proposes is meant to guide not only discovery, but also application. Just as conclusions must be tested and refined, actions based on those conclusions must be approached with care. The goal is not simply to expand power, but to ensure that it is grounded in understanding. This awareness leads to a more measured view of progress. Advancement is not an end in itself. It must be aligned with the improvement of human life. Knowledge that does not contribute to this improvement, or that creates harm through misuse, falls short of its potential. At the same time, Bacon's vision does not rely on a single individual or a small group to carry out this transformation. It depends on a collective effort that extends across time. The pursuit of knowledge becomes a shared human project, one that requires cooperation, communication, and continuity. This collective dimension changes how intellectual work is valued. Instead of focusing solely on individual achievement, The emphasis shifts toward contribution to a larger process. Each discovery, no matter how small, becomes part of a broader structure that others can build upon. This also reshapes the role of institutions. They are no longer seen primarily as places where knowledge is preserved, but as active centers of inquiry. Their purpose is to support the ongoing process of discovery, to provide the resources and structure needed for systematic investigation. Education, within this framework, becomes more than the transmission of existing knowledge. It becomes training in method. Students are taught how to observe carefully, how to question assumptions, and how to engage with the process of inquiry. This prepares them not only to understand what is known, but to contribute to what is not yet known. As this system develops, it begins to create a different kind of intellectual culture. Authority becomes less rigid, tradition less binding, and inquiry more dynamic. Ideas are not accepted because they are old or widely held, but because they withstand examination. This creates an environment where knowledge is constantly tested and refined. At the same time, this openness introduces a certain instability. Without fixed authorities, there is always the possibility of disagreement and uncertainty. But within Bacon's framework, this is not a weakness. It is a sign that inquiry is active. Stability is not achieved by eliminating disagreement, but by grounding discussion in shared methods and evidence. This shared foundation allows differences to be productive rather than divisive. Competing ideas can be tested against observation and experiment, leading to clearer understanding over time. The process remains open, but it is not directionless. As this philosophy reaches deeper maturity, it becomes clear that its true significance lies not only in the specific methods it proposes, but in the transformation it initiates. It replaces a static view of knowledge with a dynamic one, where understanding is always developing, always subject to refinement, and always connected to the world it seeks to explain. In this way, Francis Bacon's thought moves beyond a simple reform of method and becomes a comprehensive reorientation of how human beings approach truth, progress, and their own capacity to understand and shape the world, establishing a framework in which knowledge is not something to be inherited and preserved unchanged, but something to be actively built, tested, and expanded through a continuous and disciplined engagement with reality. As this vision reaches its fullest development, everything begins to settle into a single, continuous understanding where method, knowledge, power, and human responsibility are no longer separate ideas, but parts of one unfolding process. What began as a critique of flawed thinking now reveals itself as a complete transformation in how human beings relate to truth and to the world itself. At this stage, the method is no longer just a tool for inquiry. It becomes a way of thinking that shapes every aspect of understanding. The disciplined movement from observation to conclusion, the constant testing of ideas, and the awareness of the mind's limitations all combine into a stable yet flexible approach that can adapt as knowledge grows. This adaptability is essential because the world being studied is not simple or static. It is layered, complex, and often resistant to quick explanation. A rigid method would fail to capture this complexity. Bacon's approach, however, remains open, capable of refinement as new discoveries are made. It does not claim final authority, but builds authority gradually through consistency and evidence. Within this framework, truth itself is no longer seen as something that can be grasped instantly or completely. It is approached through approximation, becoming clearer over time as more evidence is gathered and more relationships are understood. This creates a sense of progress that is steady rather than dramatic, built on accumulation rather than sudden revelation. At the same time, this steady movement toward understanding begins to reshape the human sense of possibility. As knowledge expands, so does the range of what can be done. Natural processes that once seemed mysterious become accessible. Conditions that once appeared fixed begin to change under careful study and application. This expansion of capability introduces a new relationship between human beings and nature. Nature is no longer seen as something entirely beyond influence, nor as something to be approached through speculation alone. It becomes a field of interaction, where patterns can be discovered and used in ways that extend human potential. Yet within this relationship, Bacon's philosophy maintains a quiet restraint. The goal is not uncontrolled expansion of power, but informed and measured engagement. Knowledge must guide action, and action must remain connected to understanding. When this connection is lost, the same errors that once distorted thought can begin to distort practice. This is why the method must remain present at every stage, not only in discovery, but in application. The discipline that corrects the mind also regulates how knowledge is used. It ensures that progress does not become reckless, and that the growth of capability does not outpace the growth of understanding. At the same time, the collective nature of knowledge becomes even more important. No single individual can grasp the full complexity of the world. Understanding emerges through shared effort, where observations, experiments, and ideas are brought together over time. This creates a continuity that extends beyond individual lives. Within this continuity, knowledge takes on a kind of permanence that individual thinkers cannot achieve on their own. What is discovered is preserved, refined, and extended by others. Each contribution becomes part of a larger structure that continues to grow. This growing structure of knowledge begins to shape civilization itself. As understanding deepens, systems of production, communication, and organization change. Life becomes more structured around the application of knowledge, and less dependent on tradition or inherited assumptions. At the same time, Bacon's philosophy does not suggest that this transformation will eliminate all difficulty. Uncertainty remains, because the process of inquiry is never complete. New questions arise as old ones are answered. Each discovery opens further areas of investigation. This ongoing movement prevents stagnation. It ensures that knowledge does not settle into fixed forms that resist change. Instead, it remains active, always extending beyond what is currently understood. The process itself becomes the foundation, rather than any single conclusion. As this understanding becomes more complete, the earlier emphasis on correcting the mind takes on a deeper meaning. The errors Bacon identified are not simply obstacles at the beginning of inquiry. They are recurring tendencies that must be continually addressed. Even within a developed system of knowledge, the mind can fall back in a habit, assumption, or premature certainty. This creates a need for constant vigilance. The method is not something that can be applied once and then set aside. It must remain active, guiding thought at every stage. In this way, the pursuit of knowledge becomes not only an intellectual activity, but a disciplined practice. There is also a final shift in how knowledge itself is valued. It is no longer seen as an end in isolation, but as part of a broader human effort to understand and improve the conditions of life. Its worth is measured not only by its accuracy, but by its ability to contribute to a more coherent and capable way of living. This does not reduce knowledge to utility. It expands its significance. Understanding the world and improving human life become connected aspects of the same process. The clearer the understanding, the more effective the improvement. In this state, philosophy, science, and practical life are no longer separate domains. They are integrated through the method that connects observation, reasoning, and action. Each informs the other, creating a unified approach to engaging with reality. What remains at the end is not a closed system, but an open path, a way of thinking that begins with careful observation, moves through disciplined reasoning, and extends into responsible action. A way of building knowledge that is never complete, but always advancing. In the end, Francis Bacon presents a vision in which human beings are not passive recipients of knowledge, nor confined by inherited systems, but active participants in an ongoing process of discovery, where truth is approached through method, power is guided by understanding, and the world itself becomes something that can be known more clearly and engaged with more effectively through a continuous, careful, and collective effort to learn. Francis Bacon was born in 1561 in London, at a time when Europe was beginning to shift from tradition towards something more uncertain and experimental. The old structures of knowledge, built on authority, inherited texts, and long-standing beliefs, were still dominant. But cracks were beginning to appear. Exploration was expanding the known world. New discoveries were challenging accepted ideas, and there was a growing sense that knowledge itself needed to be re-examined. Bacon grew up close to power. His father held an important position under Queen Elizabeth, and from an early age, he was exposed to both politics and intellectual life. He was educated in classical traditions, studying philosophy, rhetoric, and law, absorbing the methods that had been used for centuries to understand the world. But even at a young age, something about those methods seemed incomplete to him. Much of the knowledge he encountered relied heavily on authority, on what had already been written and accepted. Arguments were often built by referencing earlier thinkers rather than by directly examining the world. This created a system that could sustain itself, but not necessarily one that could grow. He began to see a problem. If knowledge is based primarily on what has already been said, then it risks becoming closed, repeating itself rather than expanding. It becomes more about defending ideas than discovering new ones. This realization becomes the starting point for everything that follows. As he moved into public life, becoming a lawyer and later holding positions within the government, he did not abandon these concerns. Instead, they developed alongside his political career. He was not simply thinking about knowledge in isolation. He was thinking about its role in shaping society, in guiding decisions, and in influencing power. At the center of his philosophy is a simple but radical idea. That knowledge must begin with observation, not with assumptions, not with inherited beliefs, but with direct engagement with the world. Instead of starting with conclusions and working backward, he argued that one must begin with careful observation, gathering evidence, and allowing patterns to emerge gradually. This approach would later be recognized as part of what becomes the scientific method, though in his time, it was still taking form. But his contribution goes deeper than method alone. He also examined why people fail to understand the world clearly, even when evidence is available. He introduced the idea of what he called idols, patterns of thinking that distort perception. These idols are not external obstacles. They exist within the mind itself. Some come from human nature, the tendency to see patterns where none exist, or to interpret information in ways that confirm existing beliefs. Others come from individual experience, personal biases shaped by upbringing, education, and habit. There are also distortions created by language, where words shape thought in ways that are not always accurate. And finally, there are those that come from established systems of belief, traditions that are accepted without being questioned. These idols act as filters. They shape how reality is perceived, often without awareness. For Bacon, recognizing these distortions is essential. Without doing so, observation itself becomes unreliable. People may believe they're seeing clearly, when in fact they are interpreting everything through layers of bias. This leads to a more disciplined approach to knowledge. It is not enough to observe. One must also examine the way observation is being conducted, constantly questioning whether conclusions are being shaped by evidence or by assumption. At the same time, he emphasized the importance of gradual progress. Knowledge does not arrive fully formed. It develops step by step through repeated observation, testing, and refinement. This stands in contrast to systems that aim for immediate certainty. For Bacon, certainty is not something that can be declared at the beginning. It emerges slowly as patterns become clearer over time. He also believed that knowledge should have a purpose beyond intellectual satisfaction. It should improve human life, provide practical benefits, and contribute to the development of society. This idea connects knowledge directly to action. Understanding the world is not an end in itself. It is a means of shaping it. At the same time, his life reflects a tension between these ideals and the realities of power. As he rose to high positions, eventually becoming Lord Chancellor, He operated within a system that was not always aligned with the clarity and integrity he described in his philosophy. This tension becomes more visible later in his life, when he was accused of corruption and removed from his position. Whether these actions reflected personal failure or the pressures of the system he was part of remains a subject of debate. But what is clear is that his life does not present a simple alignment between thought and action. It reveals the complexity of trying to apply principles within structures that are not designed to support them fully. By the time his early ideas had taken shape, he had already introduced a shift that would influence centuries of thought, a move away from authority and toward observation, a recognition of the mind's limitations, and a method that begins not with certainty, but with careful, disciplined inquiry. And in doing so, he helped set the direction for a new way of understanding the world, one that does not rely on what has always been believed, but on what can be seen, tested, and gradually understood through experience itself. As his thinking continued to develop, what becomes increasingly clear is that Francis Bacon was not simply proposing a new method of inquiry. He was attempting to rebuild the entire foundation of how knowledge is created, tested, and trusted. His concern was not just that people made mistakes, but that the systems they relied on were structured in ways that made those mistakes almost inevitable. He began to look more closely at how knowledge had been built over centuries, and what he saw was a pattern of premature conclusions. Thinkers would begin with assumptions, often inherited from earlier authorities, and then construct arguments to support them. This created an appearance of coherence, but it was built on unstable ground. Once the starting point was flawed, everything that followed carried that flaw forward. His response to this was not to reject knowledge entirely, but to slow it down. Instead of moving quickly toward general conclusions, he argued that inquiry should begin with specific observations, gathered carefully and systematically. These observations should then be organized, compared, and tested before any broader claims are made. It is a movement from the particular to the general, rather than the other way around. This may seem straightforward, but in his time, it represented a major shift. It required patience, restraint, and a willingness to remain uncertain for longer than people were comfortable with. He believed that one of the biggest obstacles to understanding is the desire for immediate clarity. People prefer clear answers, even if those answers are incomplete or incorrect. This creates a tendency to jump ahead, to form conclusions before enough evidence has been gathered. His method resists this tendency. It demands that the mind hold back, that it continue observing even when it feels ready to conclude. At the same time, he developed a more structured approach to this process. He suggested that observations should not be random or selective, but organized in a way that allows patterns to emerge more clearly. This includes comparing instances where a phenomenon occurs, where it does not occur, and where it occurs to different degrees. By examining these variations, it becomes possible to isolate the factors that are actually responsible for a given effect. This approach moves beyond simple observation into a more analytical form of inquiry. He also emphasized the importance of experiment. Observation alone is not always enough, because it relies on what happens naturally. Experiment allows conditions to be controlled, altered, and repeated, making it possible to test ideas more directly. This introduces a more active role for the investigator. Instead of simply watching the world, one begins to interact with it, to create situations that reveal underlying patterns more clearly. At the same time, he remained deeply aware of the limitations of this process. Even with careful observation and experiment, the mind is still vulnerable to distortion. The idols he described earlier do not disappear easily. They continue to shape perception in subtle ways. This is why his method includes not just procedures, but a kind of discipline of thought, a constant awareness that conclusions must be questioned, that evidence must be re-examined, and that certainty should never be assumed too quickly. He also begins to connect this approach to a broader vision of progress. Knowledge, in his view, is not static. It grows over time, building on previous discoveries, refining them, and sometimes correcting them. This creates a different relationship to tradition. Instead of treating earlier knowledge as final, it becomes a starting point, something to be tested and expanded rather than simply accepted. This idea has long-term implications. It suggests that understanding is always incomplete, always in development. There is no final point where knowledge is finished. There is only a continuous process of refinement. At the same time, he believed that this process could lead to practical improvements in human life. By understanding the patterns of nature, people could develop tools, technologies, and systems that make life more stable, more efficient, and less dependent on chance. This introduces a connection between knowledge and power. Not power in a political sense, but in the ability to shape conditions, to influence outcomes, and to reduce uncertainty. He famously expressed this idea in a simple way. Knowledge is power. But this phrase, often repeated, carries a deeper meaning in his philosophy. It is not about control for its own sake. It is about the ability to work with the structure of reality rather than against it. At the same time, his own life continues to reflect a tension between ideal and reality. As he moved through positions of authority, he operated within systems that were influenced by ambition, competition, and pressure. His eventual fall, marked by accusations of corruption, complicates his legacy. It shows that understanding the structure of knowledge does not automatically translate into moral clarity in action. The same mind that seeks truth can still be affected by the conditions it operates within. This does not invalidate his ideas, but it adds depth to them. It shows that the challenge of aligning thought and action is not easily resolved, even for those who are aware of the problem. By this stage, his philosophy has expanded beyond a critique of existing methods into a full framework for inquiry. It includes observation, experiment, analysis, and reflection. It recognizes the limits of the human mind while still pushing toward greater clarity. And within that framework lies a shift that continues to shape how the world is understood. A movement away from certainty based on authority and toward understanding built through careful, disciplined engagement with reality itself. As his thinking continues to unfold, what becomes more evident is that Francis Bacon was not only concerned with how individuals come to know things, but with how entire societies organize knowledge. He begins to see knowledge not as a collection of isolated discoveries, but as a structured, collective effort that unfolds over time. This marks a shift from the idea of the lone thinker towards something broader. If knowledge is built slowly through observation and experiment, then it cannot depend on a single person or a single moment. It requires continuity, cooperation, and a system that allows ideas to be tested, corrected, and expanded across generations. He begins to imagine a world where knowledge is organized deliberately, where inquiry is not left to chance or individual interest alone, but guided in a way that allows it to grow more effectively. This includes the idea of institutions, places where investigation is supported, where experiments are conducted systematically, and where results are recorded and shared. This vision reflects an understanding that progress depends not only on method, but on structure. Without a system to support inquiry, even the best methods remain limited. With it, knowledge can accumulate, becoming more reliable over time. At the same time, he becomes more focused on the relationship between knowledge and usefulness. He is not interested in knowledge that remains abstract or disconnected from life. For him, understanding should lead to application. It should improve conditions, solve problems, and make life more manageable. This does not mean reducing knowledge to immediate utility. It means recognizing that understanding the patterns of nature allows for practical outcomes, whether in technology, medicine, or the organization of society itself. He begins to see nature not as something to be accepted passively, but as something that can be engaged with, studied, and gradually understood in ways that allow for meaningful change. This introduces a more active relationship between humans and the world around them. But this approach also raises questions. If knowledge gives the ability to shape reality, how should that ability be used? What limits should exist, if any? These questions are not fully developed in his work, but they are implied within his emphasis on power and application. At the same time, he continues to deepen his critique of the human mind. The idols he described earlier remain central, but their influence becomes more complex as his thought develops. They are not simply errors that can be corrected once and for all. They are ongoing tendencies that require constant attention. Even within a structured system of inquiry, these distortions can persist. People may still favor certain outcomes, interpret data selectively, or be influenced by language and tradition in subtle ways. This leads to a more demanding view of knowledge. It is not a passive process. It requires discipline, not only in method, but in thought. It requires the ability to question one's own conclusions, to remain open to correction, and to accept that understanding is always provisional. He also begins to reflect more deeply on the pace of progress. True understanding, in his view, cannot be rushed. Attempts to accelerate knowledge by skipping steps often lead to error. It is better to move slowly and build on solid ground than to move quickly and build on assumptions. This idea challenges the desire for immediate results. It suggests that patience is not a limitation, but a necessary condition for reliable knowledge. At the same time, he contrasts two different approaches to understanding. One that seeks to impose ideas on reality, forcing observations to fit existing beliefs, and another that allows reality to shape ideas, letting patterns emerge through careful study. The first approach leads to rigidity. The second allows for growth. This distinction becomes central to his philosophy. It is not just about what is known, but how it is known. He also begins to recognize that knowledge changes the relationship between humans and uncertainty. Without understanding, people rely on habit, tradition, or chance. With understanding, they gain the ability to anticipate, to plan, and to reduce the role of randomness in their lives. This does not eliminate uncertainty entirely, but it changes how it is managed. It becomes something that can be approached, analyzed, and gradually reduced rather than simply accepted. At the same time, his own life continues to reflect the complexity of applying these ideas within real systems. His rise to power and subsequent fall show that clarity in thought does not automatically translate into clarity in action. He operated within structures shaped by ambition, hierarchy, and political pressure. These conditions influence decisions in ways that are not always aligned with the principles he described. This adds a layer of realism to his philosophy. It shows that the pursuit of knowledge does not exist in isolation from other aspects of life. It is affected by context, by incentives, and by the systems within which it operates. By this stage, his philosophy presents a comprehensive vision. Knowledge begins with observation, develops through method, requires discipline, and grows within structured systems. It is always incomplete, always subject to revision, and always connected to its practical consequences. And within that vision lies a deeper shift. The idea that understanding is not something given, but something built. Not something fixed, but something that evolves. And not something separate from life, but something that shapes how life is lived, how decisions are made, and how the world itself is gradually transformed through the careful, disciplined pursuit of truth. As his life moved toward its final phase, what becomes increasingly clear is that Francis Bacon's project was never simply about improving knowledge in a narrow sense. It was about changing the direction of human effort itself. By this stage, his thinking had expanded into a vision where knowledge, method, society, and progress are all connected within a single unfolding process. He no longer sees knowledge as something that exists for its own sake, or as something reserved for a small group of thinkers. Instead, it becomes a collective enterprise, something that must be built over time, refined through collaboration, and applied in ways that shape the conditions of life itself. This leads to one of his most ambitious ideas, that humanity stands at the beginning of a long process of discovery, not at its end. The knowledge inherited from the past is not a completed system. It is only a starting point. What matters is not what has already been achieved, but what can still be discovered through a more disciplined and structured approach. This perspective introduces a new relationship to the future. Instead of looking backward for authority, attention shifts forward toward possibility. Knowledge becomes something that grows, something that expands beyond the limits of any single generation. At the same time, he becomes more explicit about the role of method in guiding this process. Without a clear method, inquiry remains scattered, dependent on chance, personality, or isolated insight. With method, it becomes cumulative. Each step builds on the last, reducing error and increasing clarity over time. But even here, he does not present method as a guarantee of truth. It is a tool, one that must be used carefully, constantly examined, and adjusted when necessary. The presence of a method does not remove the need for judgment. It only provides a structure within which judgment can operate more effectively. He also returns, in a deeper way, to the problem of the human mind. The idols are not something that can be eliminated completely. They remain present, shaping perception in ways that are often subtle and difficult to detect. This leads to a more realistic understanding of knowledge. It is not a perfect reflection of reality. It is an ongoing attempt to approach reality more closely, while recognizing that complete objectivity may never be fully achieved. This does not weaken his vision. It strengthens it. It acknowledges that progress is not about reaching absolute certainty, but about reducing error, refining understanding, and moving gradually toward greater clarity. At the same time, he reflects more clearly on the connection between knowledge and power. As understanding grows, so does the ability to influence the world. This influence can be used to improve conditions, to reduce suffering, and to create more stable systems. But it also introduces responsibility. The ability to shape reality is not neutral. It carries consequences, both intended and unintended. He does not fully develop a detailed ethical system around this, but the implication is clear. The pursuit of knowledge must be guided, not only by method, but by awareness of its effects. This adds another layer to his philosophy. It is not only about how to know, but about how that knowledge is used. At the same time, his own life stands as a reminder of how difficult it is to maintain alignment between thought and action. His fall from political power complicates his legacy, not by undermining his ideas, but by showing the tension between ideal and reality. He understood the importance of clarity, discipline, and integrity in thought, but he operated within systems that were influenced by ambition, hierarchy, and pressure. These forces do not disappear simply because they are recognized. This tension does not resolve itself in his life. It remains present, reflecting a broader truth. That understanding does not automatically produce perfect action. There is always a gap between knowing and doing. By the time of his death in 1626, what he had set in motion was far larger than his own career. His ideas would continue to influence the development of science, shaping how inquiry is conducted, how evidence is evaluated, and how knowledge is organized. But what remains most significant is not any single method or concept. It is the shift he introduced, a movement away from authority as the foundation of knowledge, and toward observation, experiment, and gradual refinement. A recognition of the limits of the human mind, paired with a commitment to overcoming those limits through discipline and structure, and an understanding that knowledge is not static, but something that grows, evolves, and reshapes the world over time. In the end, his philosophy does not offer certainty. It offers direction, a way of approaching reality that accepts uncertainty, works within it, and seeks to reduce it step by step. And once that approach begins to take hold, even slightly, the way the world is understood begins to change. It is no longer something to be explained through inherited belief alone, but something to be explored, tested, and gradually uncovered. A process that does not end, but continues, shaped by those willing to observe carefully, think critically, and accept that understanding is not given all at once, but built over time through effort, patience, and a willingness to question even the most established ideas.